Yes. So maybe
Ex-Superman and Kanye Siemens has broken his silence about his arrest, claiming disputes over candidate lists is at the center of factional battles in the province. Mr. was addressing the subject.
Yay. Oh.
We'll be starting momentarily, I believe.
Yes, I was actually about to start. I think our 5 minutes are up, and then those who join us obviously will have the opportunity to do so while we have started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event today. My name is Nomshato Lubisi, and I am the Communications Manager at Media Monitoring Africa, and I'll be your facilitator for today. For the last 5 years, we've actually had a series of events around Black Wednesday, commemorating the 19th of October 1977, in order to both celebrate media freedom, but also highlight the different issues and milestones as well. This year, however, we are using a very different format. We have collaborated with multiple organizations to host the event under one umbrella themed Nation Building Conversations. And we've already seen last week, our first event has started, and we are in day 2, and tomorrow it is our last day of a series of events under this umbrella. MMA has been monitoring the coverage of every democratic election in South Africa since 1994. And today in this discussion, we seek to unpack our interim findings from our monitoring report, on the media coverage of the 2021 local government elections. The report will answer questions such as, whose voices do we hear? What did they say? And what were the dominant narratives that were covered? We are joined by a great panel of experts today, and one of them is a former journalist and an anti-apartheid activist who is still currently playing a role in ensuring that the vision and the reality that was fought for continues to be realized. But first, I'd like to call upon William Bird, Director of Media Monitoring Africa, to give us a very warm welcome today.
Hello, thanks, Handel. It's really lovely of you all to be with us. Thank you. We really value your time. We know it's been a long day and a busy day, so we would strongly advise you to gather around with a glass of whiskey or some other beverage that is your favorite. Perhaps it might be chamomile tea, but for those of us who might need something stronger, then I think that might be a good idea. Ooh, I see we've just got the message that we're now being live streamed on Facebook, the platform of joy and delight and disinformation and hatred and a lot of other evil, nasty things. Anyway, it's really fantastic to have such a brilliant panel. You're very lucky. You're going to be seeing for the first time our interim, just a few high-level results of how the media are covering elections at the moment. There's some things there that I think are interesting and new and unexpected. And then we've got two excellent people to help us unpack some of those and speak to some of the broader trends. I happened to be lucky enough to be in a session this morning with Ibrahim where he was talking about some of the issues that I know he's going to be talking about again. And they really are key critical issues that'll leave you thinking for the rest of the night and the day, and hopefully stimulate some amazing dinner conversation. And then, of course, there's Kanita, who's been producing so many articles. I joked with her just earlier. I said, "You're sitting there twiddling your thumbs," and it's because clearly she's like many of the members of my team, sitting there burning the candle at both ends, working frantically. And I guess that's part of why we do want to celebrate today. And commemorate today, because it really is significant why we're here. And that was why, when we were thinking about this, we wanted someone like Ntate Joe to speak to it, just because there are many of the people, certainly most of my team. I myself was only around 5 years old at the time of the bannings, and I think it's really important that we remember, and that we've got someone who was there to speak to the issues, to remind us of where we were and where we are now, and to help give us that critical kind of perspective. So I know it's going to be, we've got some interesting stuff. We've got some stimulating challenges. We're going to have amazing input from all of our speakers, and then of course there's you. I see we've got some fantabulous people in the audience. Thank you so much for being with us, all of you fantabulous people. And yeah, I'm going to be quiet now and let the actual clever people get on with speaking and taking us away with this input. I can't wait to hear what they all have to say. Thanks again. Over.
Thank you so much, William, for that. And now the moment we've been waiting for, I'm going to call upon my colleague, Lista Namumba. She's the Monitoring Research and Analysis Program Manager at Media Monitoring Africa. And she's also been the MMA's Elections Project Coordinator. So she's also one of those with her hands that are quite full. And she'll be sharing the presentation on the findings that we're all here for today. Lista?
Hi, Nomshado. Thank you so much for that nice introduction. If it's okay, I won't share my video because I'll be sharing the screen and I don't want any technical difficulties to get in the way. So I hope that's okay.
That's perfect, Lista.
Can you
I'm
see
not
my
really happy
screen?
about that. I'd like to. No, I'm just kidding. Of course, that's fine. People are interested in the results. I mean, I know they like to look at us.
Yes, I mean, that's what we're all here for.
Because we're all so attractive, but I think really they should probably look at the results.
Yeah, no, let me just get on with what we're here for, and that is what is on the screen. Hello everyone. It's great to be here. Happy to be presenting the findings from our media monitoring exercise. Of course, these are interim results that we'll be presenting now. And Nomshado already did a little bit of introductions, but just to say that the results that I'll be presenting today are from the monitoring that took place between the 13th of September and the 13th of October. And she already mentioned the reason we do this monitoring, maybe just to emphasize. So we're monitoring the media's coverage of the 2021 local government elections, just to see how the media is reporting the elections, what issues are placed on the media's agenda, which political parties are getting the most coverage or least coverage, and also just to see if there are any instances of breaches to codes of conduct, or if there's any bias. So that's the reason that we're doing the monitoring. And just a little bit about the methodology. Like I mentioned, the content that we'll be presenting, or the findings I'll be presenting, are from the monitoring between the 13th of September and 13th of October 2021. And the content was collected from 43 South African online media. And then we used our in-house monitoring tool, a very cool tool called Dexter, to collect this content. And what Dexter does is that it uses machine learning to extract important information from the websites, and then stores it in the database for analysis. Of course, this machine learning that Dexter uses is supplemented by human analysis. which, to include aspects such as topics, groups, which include political parties and people who are speaking in this content. And then we also look at the race and gender dynamics of these sources in this coverage. So to start with, the monitoring that we did for this 31-day monitoring period collected a total of 2,410 items. So these were the items that were collected and analyzed for this monitoring period. And just to jump into it, you see that on the screen I've shared, there's a graph showing the article count for this monitoring period. Of course, it's in percentages. And what you see, or what you notice, is that throughout the entire monitoring period, there are peaks and troughs throughout, which means that, it could mean that there was almost an equal coverage share between the days. There's only difference of about 3. When you look at the lowest is 2% and the highest is 5%. And then the days with the lowest, that's 2% and less, we found that this was coverage that was over the weekends or maybe on a holiday, as is the case with the holiday that fell on the 24th of September. So we have 4 days with a coverage share of 5%. And some of the stories that contributed to this, the peaks on these days, the story on the reopening of candidates registration by the IEC. You remember that this was a big issue in the media last month, with some political parties coming, forth to say the ANC was being thrown a lifeline. Was being thrown a lifeline because the IEC had decided to reopen the candidates registration. Of course, the matter went to court, and you remember that the Constitutional Court ruled that the reopening of the registration was lawful by the IEC. So that received a lot of coverage. Of course, we also had the voter registration weekend. There was so much coverage on that. With the IC coming forth to urge voters to go and register, or those already registered just to check, to verify their details, and also just coverage on what was put in place to prepare for that physical registration weekend. The death of the Johannesburg mayor, Jolidi Matongo, also made the news during those 4 days peaks. And also the launches of the political manifestos, election manifestos by the political parties. So this has continued even outside of the peaks, the peaks that happened on the 16th of September, the 20th of September, the 27th of September, and of course 11th of October. Sorry, there was coverage on the election manifestos that happened throughout. We also had coverage on. Sorry about that, coverage on the, there was a video that was posted online showing the ANC Secretary, the Treasury General, Paul Mashatile, who was seen in that video handing out money to church congregants in Mpompo. So that also received a lot of coverage. Of course, the killing of the Tswane ANC councillor and candidate, Tsepo Motaung, who many people believe that whose killing many people believe that was politically motivated. I'm quoting, politically motivated and linked to the party's recent councillor candidate selection process. The arrest of the Mpumalanga MEC who was charged with murder, the replacing of the poster depicting Zulu Kings in Itaquini municipality, and of course the DA election posters in Phoenix, and all the controversy on that was also in coverage during these peaks, the peaks on these days. Just moving forward, we now look at the topics that the media reported on during the monitoring period. So I should mention that when we're doing the monitoring, we allocate each story is actually allocated a topic code, and our topics list is made up of more than 15 general topics. When you look deeper into the topics, there are a lot of topics, but then generally it's just about 15, it's about 15 topics. But then when you look at the graph that I've shared on the screen, you see that the top 5 topics, and these are political party politics, political party campaigning, political party manifesto, voter education and registration, and of course, election logistics. So these 5 topics had a combined coverage share of 72%, leaving other topics such as political violence, gender-based violence, crime, et cetera, with a combined, coverage share of 28%. And these have been grouped into what is shown as others on the graph. So when we did a deep analysis of the type of stories that were being reported under the topics, political party campaigning, political party manifestos, and political party politics, we found that much of this coverage was event-based, and further, there was no unpacking. There was actually little to no unpacking of what was contained in these election manifestos, for instance, that were being launched and that were being reported on. Unfortunately, and this is supposed to be, to be helping or to help the electorate in knowing what is promised in these election manifestos, as an example. But then the coverage, when we did analysis, we found that this coverage didn't have or didn't unpack what was being launched, or even just issues that are facing the electorate. Further, we found that issues such as service delivery, crime, gender-based violence, unemployment, etc., or health in the time of COVID-19 were not reported on adequately by the media during this monitoring period. We had service delivery only receiving a coverage share of 5%. And then the other issues that I've just mentioned had a coverage share of 2% and less. So this shows that these issues were not on the media or political agenda, and also that citizens were not driving, the media agenda or the political agenda. Moving on, when you look at who was speaking in this coverage, so the first part, I'm going to talk about groups. When we look at the groups that were speaking in this coverage, you will see that the top 5, and these are political parties, government departments, commissions or independent bodies, which include the IEC, the presidency, citizens. So these 5 had a combined coverage share or voice share of 86%, leaving only 14% for the other groups, such as experts, academia, researchers, maybe even just other groups. So these 5 commanding a voice share of 86% is quite unfortunate, because then it disadvantages the other groups that should be speaking in coverage, especially groups that are relevant to elections or local government elections. So we had a huge dominance, or a dominance by political parties with a voice share of 55%. And when I go back to the other group, the other slide, sorry, when you look at the gap between political parties at 55% and government departments at 11%, and then going further, you will see that gap is huge, and this might or implies that or shows that the media is reluctant to give other groups a space, or in coverage of the local government 21 local government elections. Moving on, our monitoring also revealed that citizens rarely spoke in this coverage, and when they spoke, it was only at 6%. So this finding is not, I should mention, it's not special to this monitoring period or coverage of these elections. Our previous monitoring exercises has revealed that citizens rarely speak in coverage of local government elections. And excuse me, during this monitoring period, they only spoke at 6%. Our concern with having citizens speak, inadequately in coverage of local government elections is that the issues that are facing the electorate will be neglected, or will continue to be neglected by those who hold, power, because we know that whoever has the most power in coverage is likely, or likely holds the most. So whoever holds the most, or whoever dominates in coverage of elections or any other issue of national importance, it likely holds the most power. So if citizens are not speaking in this coverage or in such coverage, then the issues that are facing them will not get the attention of those who hold the power, to address them. And then we also had the voices of experts missing in this coverage, and experts spoke in coverage in this monitoring period. Experts spoke in coverage at 1% and less. So what this means is that issues that are, again, facing the electorate will not, there will be no one to provide an expert view to what the electorate are facing, and also just to unpack what is promised by the politicians, so that the electorate understands better on what is promised to them. And if we just go deeper, you agree with me that if there's no expert view in such coverage, then especially in coverage of an issue like gender-based violence that Africa is grappling with, we'll have a situation where there's no one who can give proper views on how the scourge can be addressed by those in power or those wishing to be in power. So we had citizens speaking at 6% and experts speaking at 1% and less. And then, of course, political parties dominated coverage at 55%. When we go deeper in what and how these political parties were covered, we'll see that from the screen that I'm sharing, you'll see that the ANC dominated the coverage at 41%, and they were followed by the DA at 24% and the EFF at 11%. So you will see that these top 10, there are 10 political parties on your screen. These top 10 political parties had a combined coverage share of 95%, leaving only 5% for the other over 300 political parties that are contesting in this year's local government elections, as announced by the IEC. And then when we look at the top 6 that are covered, the top 6 political parties, they collectively have a share of 90%. So the top 10 had a combined share of 95%, and then the top 6 have a combined share of 90%. This is understandable that these political parties will have a bigger coverage share or voice share compared to the other political parties because they enjoy a bigger representation in the National Assembly. But then again, this comes at the expense of the other political parties, especially smaller political parties that also are contesting in this year's local government elections. So we're hoping that as we move forward, there will be more coverage more coverage given to the smaller political parties, especially now with the talks of coalition governments and all. So hopefully we can see that happening. Okay, now when we look at gender, to look at how men and women are represented in this coverage, you'll see that women are during this monitoring period, women only spoke in coverage at 19%, despite them making up 52% of the South African population. And again, these results are not special to this. In our monitoring exercises, women speak less in coverage of such issues, with men taking up the majority voice share. Of concern also is the fact that we have those genders, or those people that identify as, for instance, transsexual, transgender, only speaking in coverage of the local government elections during this period at 3%. And what this shows is that the media has put genders in brackets, as either male or female, with no regard or less regard for other genders. Also, the concern with having women speak less in coverage of local government elections, for instance, just shows that the media rarely views women as important sources in such issues. And also just perpetuates the stereotype that women are not important enough to speak in issues of national importance. So we hope that this can change. What we picked up from the monitoring is that the ANC announced during the period that over 40% of their candidates, I think it was about 43%. They said over 40% of their candidates were women. And of course, there are other women candidates in these elections. So then why aren't they all speaking this coverage? Not just the political candidates, but also the electorate, because when we look at issues such as gender-based violence, which affects mostly women in South Africa, the electorate should be speaking or should be given space in the media, to speak on such, as long as it, of course, linked to the elections. All right, so now lastly we look at race. And we'll see that colored people from the graph, colored people make up 9% of the population, and yet from the graph, you'll see that they spoke in 8% of coverage. And then you have white people making up 9% of the population, but then having a voice share of 21%. And then Black people make up 81% of the population, but had a voice share of 68%. So I would like to pose a question maybe for later. I hope it can come up during the discussion on why it is problematic to have overrepresentation or underrepresentation of some races in coverage of the local government elections. Okay, so just to conclude, we've seen, or I've shown you that there's still gaps. So the media still has a long way to go, to achieve equitable representation of one, political parties, two, of gender or of race. So just a few recommendations from Media Monitoring Africa. We hope that the media will report more on issues that are facing voters, issues such as service delivery, which received a coverage share of less than 5%, as I mentioned before, gender-based violence, which received also a small coverage share, and also issues to do with race and racism, unemployment, etc. So we hope that the media will report more on these issues, and if they should be appearing on the media agenda, and if they're not, then it might mean that maybe politicians are not talking about it. So then the media needs to talk about, or needs to question or interrogate why such issues are not appearing on the political agenda. And then also other recommendations from us, we recommend that the media should include experts in coverage of the local government elections, and also to ensure that these experts are representative of all demographic voices, of course, with an added voice focus on colored and women, because I've just shown you that the colored voices and women voices are not adequate. They should also, of course, deliberately seek out the voices of women. These are both the political parties, the political candidates, and also the electorate, just to ensure that there's that equitable representation. The media should also focus, like I mentioned, on issues like gender-based violence, femicide, and corroborate these with statistics from SAPS, and just question pro-political parties and players what they plan to do to address these social ills. We also urge the media, or recommend to the media, that they bring in children in this coverage of the local government elections, and also just find an appropriate manner in which they can make sure that children are speaking in this coverage, or their issues appearing on the issues that the media is reporting on during this period, and of course outside this period, but that the issues facing children, issues such as early childhood development, education, or general education, or children's rights in South Africa, so that they also get the attention of policymakers or the political candidates. And lastly, we recommend to the media that they probe the candidates, the candidates in these local government elections on their position on free speech, the safety of journalists, and how, of course, they plan to ensure that there's a safe and healthy environment for journalists or other media practitioners, especially those who are women, of course, because we know that women face the most challenges in the media. So that's me. Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks, Nomshado.
Thank you, Lester, for that, and for unpacking these findings, but also the monitoring team that also needs a highlight here, who worked tirelessly to ensure that we have a presentation today to present on the findings that they were working on. And not to speak much on it, because our next speakers are the ones who are going to be elaborating on the findings that Lester had just presented. So our next speaker that I'm about to introduce was in the forefront of the fight for media freedom and holding the power to account. And obviously this was in a political era where things were quite different in terms of where we are in terms of a political environment whereby in those days, obviously they were dealing with an apartheid era, and now we are completely dealing with a democratic era. And Dr. Joe Hlolwe, who is currently the chairman of the Agri-Cluster Trust and also one of the founding members of the Pan-Africanist Congress known as the PAC, and played an active role as well in the anti-pass campaign in 1960. He was also arrested and detained by the security police for various periods of time. So this is somebody who has really seen the brutality of that era. He's also a former managing editor for the Sowetan and a fellow at Harvard University. In 1994, he was appointed an input editor for the South African Broadcasting Corporation, SABC, and I see we have the current editor here as well. He then became the editor-in-chief responsible for television news and current affairs. I could go on, and I know that he is itching to also give a historical perspective on what was just presented now, but most importantly to highlight the context and contrast of what does media coverage look like now in comparison to what it was then. Ndatejo, over to you. Okay, I'm just checking if Ndatejo.
Joe was there. Oh, there he is. I hear his
Oh,
voice.
there you go. There you go. All right.
Thank you, Nomsato. We should stop meeting this way.
We really should.
Let me start by saying that this has been an emotionally difficult day for me. It was
Joe, would you mind switching on your video? Sorry to interrupt you. It's William. Are you able to switch on your video?
I have done that. I was saying it's been quite a traumatic day for me. With Nomisato, we listened this afternoon to Samkelo Maseko talking about his adventures in Nkandla. We listened to Ntombi Makhoba, who was thrown out of Malawi when she was trying to get the Bushiri story. We got a statement from SANEF about the latest statistics on violence against journalists. In a way, journalism reflects its own society. We've got to accept that. We live in a sick society today in the same way as we lived in a sick society in 1977. So all these ugly memories have been coming back to me. We currently have a post-apartheid trauma to get rid of as a society. And as journalists, we have exactly the same problem that we have a trauma that is eating into our craft. It's not just the stories we cover, not just the violence we cover, but the fact that the culture of our society has changed drastically. In 1977, we knew you could get arrested, you could get killed just for covering stories. You could have a zipper put across your mouth because you were writing and saying the wrong things. Those things are still happening today, which says we haven't learned a lot in the 44 years. Today, journalism is suffering from a couple of things. The relationship between black and white folks in this country is still at the center of our dilemma in the media industry. Technology has worsened our problems. The old media models have been shattered. I hope you won't think I am moving away from your business for tonight. I know you're supposed to be talking about fair reflections. And I remember that the press council's code enjoins us to be fair in our coverage. So it is fascinating that the media come under the spotlight tonight. Will we survive the Texas findings? But let me take you back to the 1970s. First, I must tell you that all I know about October 19, 1977 is from hearsay. I wasn't there. I'd been locked up, and at that time I had spent 7 months in solitary confinement, detained by the security police, tortured by the security police. So when these events happened, I didn't see them. I only heard about them after the fact. But I know exactly what Agri Cluster, what Percy Goboza went through, because the year before, I was at Moda B prison, the prison where they were taken to. And I was also locked up under Section 10 of the Internal Security Act, which used to fascinate us because it said you will be kept in prison for as long as the Minister of Justice felt you needed to be in prison. No trial. The only punishment you got by going there was the fact that you were taken away from your family, taken away from society, and kept with a huge number of men in big cells. And you stayed there for the duration. So I know exactly what Percy went through, what Agri went through. But what's making me particularly angry is the fact that we were stopped from having our say on anything. So when they came out and the publication I had been working for, which was The World, had been banned, it meant that that publication was silenced. And it was silenced because of the choices that Percy had made. Now, if you remember the death of the Rand Daily Mail, the Rand Daily Mail was shut down because it was pulling away from its bed, which is the white middle class readership. And it was now trying to move into the black townships. And the owners felt we are not going to make money with the new readership that the Daily Mail is pursuing. Now, Percy was a direct opposite. He took a very conservative publication and embedded it in his society. The World, after Percy took over in 1976, became one of the institutions in the Black community. And that is why, at that period, we could get arrested, go to jail, come back, and still be accepted as a hero in your society. You could be killed by the police, but you remained a hero in your society. So in brief, the way I say it is that we as an industry need to embed ourselves in our readership, in our listenership, in our viewership. It is the only way we can achieve the things that the Percy Gobozas, the agri-clusters achieved. At the time, the 1994 elections happened. The Sowetan was the biggest selling daily newspaper because it had embedded itself in the Black community. I had so many more things to say, but 10 minutes to try and traverse so many years is a little unfair, William. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ntatejo. I think those 10 minutes, we were happily waiting to even extend them because you are really highlighting a lot of key moments that happened and also the journey that it took for us to get here. And you highlighted our earlier on event whereby we had Untate Mazwayo also speaking about how it got to a point of democracy and how the media itself was not yet prepared for what does media look like in South Africa in a democratic era. And I think currently what we're struggling with is upholding that responsibility, especially in such a robust, era where we have social media and we have politicians who are very influential and also at some current points, holding journalism integrity at their core agendas in different discussions. We've got a lot to go into, but I am definitely looking forward to the questions that are to come and to our engagement after. So for now, I will just ask Kanita Hunter, who is a very I have no words for her. She knows everything I have to say about her, but I will read out her bio, which I had to cut short. She's an award-winning journalist and political editor at News 24, and she's been currently having countless conversations around the media coverage during our current elections. She has won the Vodacom Journalist of the Year in 2016 and 2017. She is the author of Balance of Power, Ramaphosa and the Future of South Africa. Her political analysis has featured on all major national and international news outlets. She will be highlighting the perspective of a media who's currently covering the elections in this democratic era, and also her experiences as a journalist in covering elections. Kanita, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's very difficult to speak after Bra Tlole has been speaking. It's phenomenal what he has to say, and we could listen to him all night. But I'll say my little bit to add to the conversation and to the debate. So covering local government elections is difficult for many reasons, and I want to go through each sort of difficulty and explain the perspective of the other side of things. The first is, number one, you are reporting on elections in a COVID world, and that means that it's not being done. Things are not being done the way it used to. So you're not having big rallies. They're not you're unable to go into communities for safety issues in relation to COVID-19. The second thing is that newsrooms are not the size that they used to be. We have to do more with a whole lot less, just to keep that in mind. The third thing is you have a lot more political parties, but you don't have political maturity. And so in many ways, political, the political party leaders are still very much petty, and in some areas, journalists are still regarded as the enemy. And then you have this extraordinary situation where almost all municipalities, that's a very sweeping statement, but besides 7%, the rest of municipalities in South Africa are completely broken. Political parties know that, the ANC knows that, the EFF, the DA knows that, and that's why it makes this elections very interesting. The reality, however, for people on the ground is that they are living the human consequences of a failed local government. When we read Auditor General reports about municipalities that are dysfunctional, municipalities who couldn't care to submit returns, municipalities who literally do not spend any money on infrastructure maintenance, our readers live this reality every day. And I often joke about that the city of Johannesburg, living in the city of Johannesburg is an extreme sport, but I don't know what it must be like to be living in Kwakwa, in Maluto Upperfong municipality, or living in Swartrugens or Costa, or living in Mitsima. So the story about failed municipalities is not news, because by most accounts, news is sort of, what's different, what sets things apart. And it's the norm to have broken municipalities. And so what we find happening is, as News 24, we took the approach to say, we're not going to follow too much in the tail of political party leaders, but we're going to go into communities and we're going to tell the story. But more than telling the story, because it's very nice to put a mic in front of an ordinary citizen who will tell you there's no water and there's no electricity. But we wanted to tell the story of why. And that's what we used, open source data that we found for almost every municipality. So the first project we did was interrogating the Auditor General's report and finding fantastic stories. So whether that's the Mafube municipality, we did it for Metsimaholo municipality, we did it for Maluti Apofong, right? And the list goes on. Then it's looking at what communities are doing to force government to render basic services. And that's fantastic, court documents about, in Kentani in the Eastern Cape, Namatoli municipality, they're forcing them to provide water, right? And then we looked at parliamentary reports. And so our stories were layered in that way. And the reason why we did it was twofold. Obviously, to get into the data and tell the story of why, but also going to communities was not as accessible or not as probably valuable as it probably was, or not valuable is not the right word, but easy as it was before because of the COVID-19 context that we're operating in, right? Then what we did was we went out to communities. Now, when we're writing stories about what's happening in Maluti Apofong, what's happening in Mafube municipality, and what's happening in Kentani, I can tell you that our audience is not reading it in a way that they will read. Yes, you have those that are reading it, but they're not reading it in a way that they will read a bizarre claim by Julius Malema, right? And the question is why, right? And this is something that I've been battling with, and I hope to hear some answers from you guys here tonight, in the sense that people live the reality of a dysfunctional municipality. Local government is broken for almost all of us, besides the 7% of municipalities that are not dysfunctional and are working fine, and are just working fine, not really thriving. It's broken for everyone else. And so you'd be telling the same story in different ways. Now, what happens in this municipal elections is that there's a conflation of issues, that it becomes about everything else besides local municipal issues. If you look at the ANC's campaign, it's basically Ramaphosa, the president, making grand promises to the electorate as if he is going to be sitting in these councils. The same thing with John Steenhuisen and the Democratic Alliance. Yes, they've made the promise that, their message is the DA does it better, and perhaps the data can back that up. But I mean, what does the data say in terms of when they are in coalitions, right? And then the third point being, a big factor of this elections is going to be coalition governments. It's a reality, it's here to stay. The reality, though, is that the coalitions that we've seen in the last 5 years, in the last term, from 2016 to 2021, have proven to be completely useless. And so, ordinary citizens are literally saying, okay, we had one party dominating, that didn't work. We tried this coalition thing, it's not working. So now what we're having is something that gives me sleepless nights, and that is in relation to voter apathy. And voter apathy is, I think, going to be the biggest threat to democracy, of people just not bothering to vote. I worry about it, and I think the IEC shares the same concern, but they're a lot more optimistic about it. And to just conclude by saying that this analysis by Media Monitoring Africa about election coverage is incredibly helpful and will guide us in the next week or two left before the elections, and obviously in guiding us how we tell stories after elections. We tried very hard as News 24, and I know a lot of other media houses have done the same, to tell the stories of ordinary communities, of going to the far-flung areas, not focusing on urban areas and the metros alone, telling the stories. But this is the reality. The reality is we send an entire team to Nelson Mandela Bay to tell the story of extreme poverty, extreme failure by local government, where an 8-year-old child died as a result of inefficiency in local government. and nobody read the story. I mean, nobody read the story. Nobody read the story in comparison to someone reading a story about, you know, Ramaphosa promises X, Y, and Z. And so that's another thing that we have to factor in the analysis of our media coverage, is that we are so focused on personalities. We've become almost cult-like as South Africans. And the reality of it is that the system is so broken that people are living it and don't want to read about it. And I think that perhaps as we take this discussion forward, that maybe we need to start considering the role of journalists in almost like problem solving. So, you know, how can you create some sort of changes as a citizen? Because you have this explosion of both the apathy on one hand and then exploitation of issues by political parties, and you don't find real sustainable solutions on the cards. And so that's just sort of my preliminary thoughts on Shadow, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much for that, Kanita. I think you touched on a lot of things, and also I think brought forward some reflection points from our side as an audience, but also from a media perspective, looking at the role of the media. I seen that Joe's hand is up, so I will give that allowance for him to perhaps, I'm not sure if it's a comment, Dr. Joe, or maybe it's a question, or maybe answering something she mentioned.
It's a question, Namshad. Is there any organization or any publication?
Sorry, Dr. Joe, I think you're muted.
Oh,
there you go.
No, we can hear him.
Okay.
Is there any organization or any publication that is keeping a dashboard of all the performance promises made by parties or by candidates, etc., where they can be scored every week or every month on how far they have met their promises?
Dr. Joe, so that's very difficult to do because of the outlandish promises that you have, right? So what we've now done at News 24 is created a massive digital journalism project called Out of Order, where we're basically saying, not like leave alone the fantastical sort of promises that parties make, just what does a municipality need to survive, right? And so we rate them. So this is in terms of, governance, in terms of infrastructure spend, in terms of electricity provision, in terms of poverty alleviation. So we've created this metric, which you then can go and rate. And what we've also included is sort of a gamification part of it, where you're able to sort of see if there are better councillors in a municipality, what would it be to the overall performance, for example. And I think that's probably the starting point in keeping track of things. It's difficult to sort of, with the 250 plus municipalities, just to say, every political party, what they've promised and how they are, but just on the basics, we're using the basics as a benchmark to say, this is what you ought to provide, and this is what this is how the municipality is failing. And I think that this project, Out of Order, that News 24 launched this week, is a fantastic data journalism project, has legs to grow. And I think that it can become this really robust tool to consistently and periodically, check politicians and check parties who are sort of elected into power. The other point that I wanted to also make is that we have a huge conundrum around coalition governments and the instability that it's bringing. And so we need to also be having conversations about, after elections, of course, is that when we do have the inevitable coalitions that we're going to see, how are those parties coming together, not going to be for personal self-interest, self-ambition, that kind of thing, but actually for servicing people.
Thank you so much, Kanita, for that input. I know I'm looking at time, so I'm going to just allow our next speaker, Ibrahim, to go. And then afterwards, I'd like everyone to start posting their questions in the chat, or if they perhaps have any questions that they have in mind for our previous speakers as well. Dr. Ali, I recognize your hand, and I'll definitely give you the platform to ask your question when we have a Q&A. Up next, I know he did donate his 10 minutes, and I think we all want to donate an hour to Indate Joe. We have Mr. Ibrahim Fakir, and he is currently the Director of Programs at ASRI, which is a Socio-Economic Research Institute. He was awarded the Ruth First Fellowship for 2014 at Wits University, and was also a part-time lecturer at Wits School of Governance and at the university in 2018. Until October 2016, he headed the political parties and parliamentary program at the Electoral Institute, where he edited and published the election update, which focused on analyzing SA elections. Once again, I think we've got quite a great panel today that I really had to cut short their bios because they've really achieved a lot in their space. But Mr. Ibrahim, I hope you're ready for us with your presentation. You can go.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. And now that you haven't allowed me to donate my 10 minutes to Indate Joe, I'm going to start with something that he left off with. And that is to say that the media is often a reflection of the kind of society we're in. And many of us have been trying to say something of that sort, perhaps not as articulately, but certainly in that spirit, that we have to take a long, hard look at who we are and how we perform. And if you remember, if I can take you back to the Zondo Commission a little while ago, and the head of IT at the South African Revenue Service became a bit of a laughing stock. And I remember tweeting at the time that we should all take a long, hard look at ourselves, because this woman was in fact a reflection on the rest of us. The same is true, I hazard to say, unfortunately, of the former COO of the public broadcaster. It's not entirely an aberration. It's the kind of thing, it's the kind of behavior we accept and perhaps even encourage as South Africans. But be that as it may, that's the first point I wanted. The second, which is a shoot off from that point, is that you get the kind of political leaders and you get the kind of politicians you elect. Politicians don't, except perhaps for some parts of the continent, politicians don't put themselves in power. They are put there by someone, and that is the rest of us. But anyway, I'm going to try and get into what I was going to talk about and try and be as brief as possible. And I'm not going to repeat what I said at a previous MMA event about 2 or 3 weeks ago. But I am going to start off by saying that I take your guys' monitoring tool fairly seriously, and in my election updates previously published your findings anyway. And again, I hazard to say it's a sad reflection, but one gets the sense that the elections are actually about the political parties, not the voters, when in fact political parties are just mere contestants. Elections are fundamentally actually about voters and voters' concerns. Yet, if you look at the spread of the coverage, and your guys' excellent monitoring and your content analysis of it shows that this is in fact not the case. But be that as it may, I was asked to reflect a little bit on our politics, and that's what I'm going to try and do now. And I'll talk a little bit about the relationship of our politics and our media. So first, bad politics often trumps policy, or it translates into bad policy. Now, there are certain societies in which bad politics can be stomached for a while. Trump in the US, Boris Johnson in the UK, and so on. The thing is, those societies have durable institutions which have been built over time. Our institutions are still fairly fragile. If you think about where we are as a society, we're only 20 years into a transition. Local government as a democratic expression of both executive and legislative power at the local level is only 20 years in the making. So 2000 was effectively the transition. Second point to make is that local government is still undergoing a process of transformation and transition. So, you know, you've had Project Consolidate, you had interventions under one of the sections of the constitution where the province intervenes in municipalities, and now you got the district development model. And over time, societies go through transition and transformation fatigue. So at some point, there has to be settlement about what we're looking at. But that's the second broad point to make. Bad politics often leads to bad policy. And though both politics and policy remain important, they are profoundly personality driven at the moment. Our type of politics appear to want to facilitate either closed patronage networks through continued manipulation of state tenders, procurement, meddling in state institution, manipulation of processes, all the things we commonly call state capture. The other, which seems more benign, but is just as pernicious, tries to have a slightly more open approach to politics, but it has its own patron-client set of networks and networks of influence. And this is what you find happening at local government. So that's the crisis of local governments. But where does this come from? You know, governance in government is not a priori fact. It doesn't exist. It doesn't emerge of its own. It's a post-political fact, right? So if you had bad politics, you're going to end up with bad government. And unfortunately, there's a global crisis of politics. This is generalized across the world, and it's particular to political parties. And in South Africa, what we're seeing in the local government elections context is the rise of independents. So these independents are coming, and perhaps they emerge out of this credibility crisis in political parties and out of the fractional and factional credibility crisis that's emergent in parties, right? But there are more cynical reasons why you have these independents emerging. Some genuinely independent, some emerge out of Residents' Ratepayers Association, and yet others, unfortunately, are proxies which are emergent from political parties themselves. Why? Political party develops a bad rep in a particular area, unresponsive, unaccountable. They know in their own name they have very little chance of being elected. So you put up someone who acts as your proxy. Of course, those people are only going to contest ward elections because independents don't ever contest the PR portion. And so even though that happens, at least these parties give themselves a shot to win a ward. Now, we got to then problematize this question of the rise of independence within the context of a credibility crisis. But this special crisis is not just a crisis of political parties. It's a crisis of democracy and democratic government overall. It's manifested in two things. First, low levels of trust and confidence in political parties. Second, low levels of trust and confidence in institutions generally. The latest Afrobarometer findings make one incredibly horrifying finding. That is that 2/3 of South Africans would rather give up process of democratic elections if a non-elected government could provide security, housing, and jobs. Even more worryingly, close to half of these people would be very willing to do so, but demographically, they would fall in the higher levels of the educated in society, and they are slightly younger people. That means the future of democratic government, democracy as a form of exercise of authority, and democracy as a form of and practice in society is perhaps in great peril. And this is clear in other data that is provided. I mean, look at the level of trust in institutions generally. Fewer than 30% people trust Parliament, even less the provinces and provincial executives. When you talk about the governing party, only about 25%. Opposition parties, even slightly lower, 23, 24%. Local councils, trust in local councils is less than a quarter. Worryingly, the Electoral Commission, which historically had very high credibility ratings, in contradistinction to this period coming into the local elections, they are only enjoying support amongst 1/3 of South Africans, whereas until 2016, Both the South African Attitude Survey and the Afrobarometer showed that at least 2/3 of people trusted the IEC as much as they trusted the courts. Now that has dropped cataclysmically. And even in the face of this, unfortunately, the IEC has not been consistent or been at the forefront of correcting the kind of misperceptions and the assault on their credibility which has been made by political parties. So that's an incredibly worrying picture when you get into this, right? The media, the good news for most of you media practitioners is that the majority of citizens actually trust the media more than they do political parties or other institutions. This is true for both the public broadcaster and it is true for the private media. But when we look at the private media, the coverage is often myopic and poor. The agenda, and this is another finding historically that the MMA media monitoring has found, is that the agenda is always set by politicians. The media simply echoes what politicians' concerns are. That's why the first point I made is that you'd think the elections are about the parties, not about the voters. So that's a deep problem. The second is that the media somehow believes that if you provide a deluge of information, that it will serve the public well. No, it doesn't. The reason why you're in the media is you sift the information, you decide what is topical, what is useful, and what is newsworthy. And so news values appear to have disappeared in terms of the way in what is put out there. You just have a deluge of information, often unfiltered and of poor quality. Very seriously, Kranitz has pointed this out, so does your report, MMA, that the issues are undifferentiated. You get a little sense that this is a local government election. I mean, people are talking about land and jobs, manje. That has everything to do with national policy rather than local policy. And in a way, none of this land and jobs issues are tied to local concerns of the way in which local government can actually address the issues of jobs or the economy or anything else for that matter, right? So it's the completely undifferentiated deluge of information. And then there's the series of misinformation and disinformation which does the rounds. Some of it falls within the realm of free campaigning speech, of political rhetoric, and so on. But some of it is now actually contravening the electoral code of conduct. And yet the media is often repeating some of these claims, particularly some of that coming from the more sort of right-wing campaign issues of some of the political parties. When you look at the way in which the political parties are actually covered, I hate to say that there's a degree of fairness when it comes to the ANC. Of course, there's a lot of criticism, there's lots of critical coverage, but it's generally quite fair. Some of it is balanced, even though there's a lot of ridicule and so on of the governing party, much of it which is well earned. When it comes to the DA, of course, the DA is its own worst enemy. It's unsure of who it is. It's unsure what it wants to be. It's unsure of who it wants what for. So it's often inconsistent. It lurches from issue to issue in an uncoordinated way. But there are some kernels of not wisdom, but they're kernels of truth. They're kernels of ways in which they project a real campaign message, which is actually not covered by the media in general. So to a fault, across the board, they get completely unfair coverage. It's almost as if, the media and South Africans live to hate this political party. Not that I hold any brief for them. I mean, they would claim that I despise and hate them. Probably part of that's true, but it's not my kind of politics. But anyway, a fair and objective assessment is that they universally get unfair coverage. Of course, I congratulated Alistair Otter, who was part of this doing the index of the municipalities, which News 24 launched today, and that was very good. But it's the first bit of decent coverage which objectively shows that, look, these guys do run municipalities, even if their objectives are lopsided, the municipality is run cleanly. By contrast, the EFF is guaranteed consistently and universally fair coverage, despite their own complaints. It's almost like the media are their stenographers, and there's this kind of immature and infantile fascination with the CIC and their political gymnastics. And it's astounding the way in which there is just this blanket, uncritical coverage. by and large, this is a deep problem, because as a media, as a fraternity, as a set of professionals, you have to ask critical questions about who's going through filtering and deciding what is newsworthy and where the news values actually lie. Finally, when it comes to the credibility of the IEC itself has not been out there to defend its own reputation, its own credibility, but neither has the media. And often the media has repeated uncritically the worst kind of accusations made against the IEC. And therefore, it's not surprising that the credibility rating of the IEC is this low, because over time, the seeping nonsense accusations made by political parties and their supporters has been uncritically reflected, and that is now seeping into the public consciousness. And so this is something that we have to take a long, hard look at, in the way in which the media has behaved in terms of the integrity, credibility, and trust in institutions overall.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim, and I think you really gave us even 2 minutes to spare there, but also for highlighting that perspective, that political perspective and context for us. And now I'd like to round it back to Untate Joe. After hearing from the different speakers that we had today, what is your response to some of the key inputs that they have given us today? And I know that when we had to obviously cut you short a bit there, you did end off on a note speaking on, how a media, and I think Ibrahim spoke to this as well, is representative and reflective of the society we live in. And Dr. Joe, if you could just give us your response after hearing, I think, such great inputs from our two speakers.
Can I say to, how do you pronounce your name? Queeneth.
Anyhow, it's fine. You could say Juanita.
Congratulations on your out of order. It's very well thought out. It's very well done. But essentially, what I'm picking up tonight is that it's not just the municipalities that are broken. Journalism itself is under very serious threat. I think Ibrahim stated it very clearly that we are rather gullible, our credibility is going down the tubes, and we are doing very little to try and retrieve our credibility. So as we look at the political parties up to the elections, we should be looking at ourselves as an industry beyond the elections and saying, are we serving our readers? Are we serving our viewers? Are we serving our listeners to the extent that we should be doing? So this discussion, in fact, has raised more questions in my mind than given me answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ndata Joe, for that. And I agree with you on that one. I think the discussions today really raised a lot of questions and obviously also highlighted a lot of action that needs to be taken to ensure that we are filling up those gaps where obviously flags are being raised. I'm going to open up the floor to any audience member who has a question for one of our panelists or all of our panelists. We'll just take about 3 questions, as I know time is really not on our side. So if you do have a question, please use the raise hand function, or you can obviously use the chat as well. A lot to take in. And I think I was in a previous discussion like this as well. After we had our inputs, there was really silence of we have a long way to go. So I'll give it a few more minutes. And obviously, while you are thinking perhaps of any questions that you'd like to pose towards our panelists, and especially Untate Joe, and, to use this opportunity and highlight the fact that it's really, a very key moment to actually have somebody who has lived through those experiences and gets to even speak on those experiences in our platform today. I see Dr. Ali. You're muted.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. How are you?
Fine, thanks, and you?
My name is Dr. Ali Omar Abati. I'm chairman of Somali National Union Party. Also, I'm studying in professional journalism in Somali National University. Because after 6 months, we have made 2 research. First is COVID-19. The second is made gender-based violence and child-based violence. We have succeeded after 6 months. Then we sent to the Minister of Women Development and Human Rights. Then I have 2 questions. First is, what role does social media can play political process quiz late? The second is, how can media influence in politicals? It is the end. Okay.
All right, I think I got your 2 questions. The first one, looking at the role of social media, especially when you're looking at media coverage and obviously societal influence in terms of information. And the second question, looking at the political influence, and I think this was also raised a bit towards media, correct? Okay, cool. Okay, thank you. I think I will take the next question, Lerato, and then I'll open up the floor for the panelists to go ahead and answer those questions for us. Lerato, you can go ahead.
Good evening, everybody. I just wanted to ask, does the panel foresee litigation follow with these current elections? I remember with the previous elections, there were a couple of litigations, especially asking for interdicts. I know there was one case that was unsuccessful, and then there was one case with I think Karima Brown, which actually did get an interdict. So that's one question. Do they foresee any litigation that will occur during these elections? And then secondly, do they think that it is quite advisable, for journalists to have some sort of legislation that protects them, instead of the Electoral Act, for example? What happens when it's not elections? How do people or journalists in particular, how do they get, some sort of relief from any harassment that might occur to them during, not just during election time, but like post-elections, or just on the ordinary, I don't know how to put it, but on an ordinary scale or on an ordinary day, how do they get relief instead of always just using Protection from Harassment Act, or even getting interdicts and urgent applications to address those problems? Do they think that it's time that journalists actually get some sort of legislation that speaks directly to their work and to protect them from online harassment in particular?
Thank you so much, Lerato, for your questions. I think you raised very good questions. I see one last hand went up. Okay, I think we'll take Kathy's question and then we'll go into giving the panelists an opportunity to answer. Kathy, you can go ahead.
Thanks, Nomshado. So my question's for Juanita. I just wanted to say to her, so I represent Quote This Woman Plus, and we've got a database of women experts who speak on matters around the elections as well as on other things. And I was really interested in the way she unpacked where journalists are sitting currently in terms of positioning their news stories. And I was just wondering, for experts who feel like they have particular insight into issues that could try and make some of the service delivery stories perhaps rise above the drudgery of the day-to-day experience of the man in the street or the person in the street. What advice would she give to an expert who wanted to reach out to a media house and say, hey, I really think I have a story that needs to be told, or I have a perspective that could make this newsworthy? How would she advise experts to reach out to journalists if they feel they have a burning story that should be told during the elections?
Okay, thank you so much, Kathy, for your question. However, I think Kanita had to drop out of the call, but I'll definitely pocket that question, and I'm hoping she can join back in. It's only because I'm not sure somebody else is muted. Okay, it's only because she had another event as well at a similar time than ours. What I will do though is give our two speakers that are still here an opportunity to perhaps speak to those questions that were asked, and as well as perhaps giving us also their closing remarks as well. So we're looking at the question around the role of social media. We're looking, and I think Ibrahim, you'll be able to speak to this, especially the legislation question by Lerato, which is a very important one. And I think Senef obviously it's a project that they are working on, and I see Isak is also part of our conversation here today. Maybe he might elaborate a bit more also on the chat as well. And then in Tatajo, there was a question around political influence, because obviously we saw during the apartheid era that you were fighting against a government that really was, pushing censorship. And however, now you're looking at issues of political influence towards media coverage. Oh, I see Patiswa. Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you for raising your hand. I was going to pick on you, giving time, but please go ahead and unmute yourself. You can go ahead and speak.
Thank you, and good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I just to the point that Brajo made in his opening statement, and he made reference to Percy and his contemporaries who embedded themselves in the communities they covered. And this makes me think about what we are doing versus what we probably need to do to enhance the quality of our coverage of the communities that require our presence. And one of the things that I've been grappling with is it is clear that being passive observers to what is happening in the country is not necessarily helping the citizens, in the sense that when you relay information, because it's basically that, you are relaying information, you are not necessarily assisting the citizenry to think critically about what's going on and engage with the issues as they arise. Should we be taking a step further to becoming active witnesses, as in the case of the Percy Qobozas that we are talking about, who took interest in actively engaging with the issues as the communities and society were grappling with them, and raising a different level of consciousness in how those issues were dealt with. So this is one part of my question. But to MMA, I want to understand you've outlined the methodology, but I want to understand if the survey itself is inclusive of broadcast platforms, or is it just information that has been taken online, but still inclusive of what would have come from broadcast platforms and then placed online? So I just want clarity on that one.
Okay. All right. I'm looking at time, so I'm gonna go ahead and allow Mr. Ibrahim and Dr. Joe to speak to those questions and also perhaps give us their wrap up as well. And then I'll give Lester a few minutes, 2 minutes, to just quickly speak to Patiso's question around the methodology and obviously the different media formats that were monitored. Dr. Joe?
Can I start with Patiswa's issue? How we embed ourselves in our viewership and our listenership and our readership. I think one of the issues that has emerged recently is that your journalists no longer come from the downtrodden in our society. We are from the upper levels of our society, and we just parachute into the townships, into the shanty towns, get a story and get out again. When we knock off, we drive straight to the northern suburbs. So you no longer have that link between the people who are supposed to be viewing you and the people who are actually viewing you. So there is a disjunction there. We need a way in which we can have communities influence what is published. I remember a time when the Sowetan was very strange. You would get queues of people coming in there, either having brought community news or coming in because they've got a complaint and they want the newspaper to help them with that complaint. So it was that type of relationship that those publications had with their readers. It's a relationship that we no longer have. On the legislation, I think it will be dangerous for us to go and ask for special treatment as journalists, because the rights we have as journalists are the rights that every citizen has. So if we want to exclude ourselves and say we need special protection, we will be asking for government's foot in our business. Social media, unfortunately, that is a dangerous territory, and I would rather not get into it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joe, for those remarks and the inputs that you have given us. Mr. Ibrahim, are you still with us?
Hi, gosh, sorry.
I know. It happened.
After all this time using this technology, one still gets flummoxed. Anyway, yes, I'm very much here. I look on the social media stuff. I've been doing some work with the Center for Analytics and Behavioral Change, where we've been tracking social media conversations pretty much in the same way that MMA has been doing for the mainstream media. Ours is a very small slice. And those, I'm not going to elaborate on it. Those reports are available on News 24. They've been published weekly, and I can send links to those which you can circulate later. So I won't spend much time on it. The question around legislation has been covered, and I think I agree fully with Dr. Joe, because, you know, the Constitution and the common law already protects journalists to the maximum extent that it can. Asking for anything more is foolhardy. The late Karima Brown and online bullying and so on, you know, while there was an interdict, it was pretty unsatisfactory because the court did not, in fact, find fully that the behavior of one of the parties was, to put it mildly, completely in contravention, not just of the code of conduct, but of the Electoral Act. It's unfortunate they didn't go that far, but you know, that is how it is. On the on the potential court cases, I mean, they've already been. The DA took the IEC to court because they thought that the candidate lists should not have been reopened. Herman Mashaba has taken the IEC to court, and then it was revealed that they are unable to simply fill out a form that some of us, even in primary school, can probably do better. So this kind of assault is going to go on. We should know, all of us, that the oversight architecture and the regulatory architecture that govern our elections are actually state of the art and are very good. So there are many dispute resolution mechanisms. The first is that, remember, there are multi-party liaison committees, which the IEC has and meets with political parties in the month before elections weekly. That political parties don't attend the multi-party liaison committee is their problem. And they often do that so that they can say, oh no, we weren't consulted. When actually by law, this thing has to happen. If you don't attend, that's your problem. And parties are great at doing that. Second is that every party is allowed to have party agents, and party agents have a role even to watch not just the process of elections, but even the counting of the ballots and the results. They can sign off on the result slips, and by law, every voting station must paste the result slip outside. That means that if you have enough time, energy, and resources, you can go and collate from every voting station the result, which is signed off, and collate, and you get a fair idea of what's going on. Third is that the conflict management panels which would mediate certain conflicts which are brought to the IEC. And then lastly, the electoral court. So I do think that there are going to be disputes. Many of these are going to be preemptive, so that people or parties need to excuse their poorer than expected performance and so on. But we should be cautious that though the IEC is in a bit of a pickle, they still have a very well-deserved reputation for efficiency and effectiveness. And we should take the complaints made by political parties and try to verify them and ensure that there is a legitimacy to them, because many of them are going to be spurious. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. And I see one participant has been robust in asking questions. And unfortunately, due to time, and we've well gone into an hour and a half of this conversation, I'll have to ask you to please pocket those questions, and I'll also note them. And perhaps we'll see if we can get back to you on those. Lester, your 2 minutes to speak to the media formats and methodology.
Thanks, Nomshado. So for the findings that are presented today are from, as mentioned, 43 print and online media houses or outlets or platform websites. But we are also monitoring electronic media, which includes the SABC, most of their major news stations, including radio. And these findings will be available at the end of the monitoring period, which is 2 weeks after voting day. So what I presented today is just from print and online media, of course, with SABC News Online platform. We're going to have overall reports at the end of the monitoring period, which will have a separate one for print and online media, similar to what I presented today, and another one or just.
I'm not sure if we lost Lester. Okay, I think we lost Lester, but I'm okay. The audio. All right. Lester.
Sorry, I got cut. Yeah, I got cut. I hope you got or the speaker, sorry, the participant that asked got my response.
No, definitely, we got majority of that, and I think we can definitely engage with Patusa as we get towards the time whereby we are going to be releasing the final monitoring report. Okay, I see a lot of people are very interested in the questions that were asked by one of our participants, so I'll make it my own project to see if I can't get those answers for you. But because of time, I'd like to thank everyone for their time and really an engaging conversation. I'm not doing the thank yous. William will be coming back to do so, but I really had to share my gratitude, especially to the likes of Ndata Joe for giving us the time after a very long day of conversations to really give us your perspective and input. William, over to you for the voting of thanks.
I like that you called it a voting of thanks.
I mean, yes.
I vote that we say thanks everyone and leave it, but I will be slightly longer than that. But yes, I thought it was such a lovely session. Conita giving some fascinating, nuanced perspectives, and Ibrahim, lovely, incisive comments and perspectives, and you know, a bit of a reality check on some of the issues, and such a lovely, moving memories and powerful comments from Tate Joe. And of course, thank you to my fabulous team. I think we'll handle if we keep this going 1 minute longer, her eyes will shut while we're still going on. I think she's in desperate need of a night's sleep, having worked on the report overnight to get it into a sexy looking condition so that it'll be on our site first thing tomorrow. If people want to know more, you can get hold of Lister. The other thing I can strongly recommend, Itzhak posted in the chat, there's a fabulous resource on the SANEF website. Information there. There's lots of courses, lots of resources. There's a ton of stuff there. Go there, have a look. You'll spend a long time. It's really, really good. Also have a look at the News 24 thing. That's excellent. And then finally, if you enjoyed Lister's voice and you want to see what she looks like, you'll be able to catch her live this Saturday evening at 6:30 on Newsroom Africa, where she does a weekly take on media coverage. And then, big bonus for you, you'll be able to see what Nomshado looks like with her eyes more wide open on Monday at about 4 o'clock, also on Newsroom Africa, where she talks about trends and mis and disinformation. So make sure that you're there. Thanks so much, everyone, for your time. Thank you so massively much to our fabulous panel. Have a good evening, everyone. Get some dinner. Over and out.